Good afternoon. Welcome to episode 112 of the Political Mike podcast. In the year 2023 alone, a staggering 24,535 lives were claimed by gun violence. 24,535 dreams cut short. 24,535 families left shattered. Among them were 410 victims of mass shootings, where sacred places like churches, grocery stores, and movie theaters became the scenes of unthinkable horrors. This uniquely American epidemic knows no bounds, reaching every corner of our land from bustling metropolises to the quietest rural towns. But this haunting reality did not just emerge overnight. Let's go back to April 20th, 1999, with the unforgettable tragedy that unfolded at Columbine High School in Colorado, as Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris unleashed chaos, firing off 188 rounds of ammunition. 12 students and a teacher lost their lives, and over 20 others were wounded. The shooters got a friend to buy some of the weapons at a gun show that didn't require a background check. This, of course, became known as the gun show loophole. In the wake of the shootings, thousands protested in Denver, demanding action. They had a cause: the restriction of gun access in America, and they were united against a common enemy, the National Rifle Association. Columbine was a turning point that spurred policymakers to act, seeking solutions to keep our schools safe from such horror. But private discussions of the National Rifle Association just blocks away from the state capitol during those protests foreshadowed the decades-long campaign to shift the narrative away from any kind of gun control. Contemplating a more sympathetic response than their public stance, they grappled with difficult choices and considered $1 million fund for victims. The Columbine shooting was, at the time, the deadliest shooting since the late 1960s, threatening to provide a tragic backdrop to the NRA's previously scheduled annual convention in Denver. Billboards advertising world-class guns and gear expo already peppered the city. Meanwhile, hate mail began arriving at the NRA's offices. 13 people lay dead at the high school. More than 20 were injured. In private discussions, NRA official Kane Robinson said, "Everything we do has a downside. Don't anybody kid yourself about this great macho thing of going down there and showing our chest and showing how tough we are." In other words, she said, we are in deep trouble. Yet despite those private discussions, the NRA's public message following subsequent mass shootings remained steadfast, rejecting calls for policy debates and asserting their unwavering belief in the right to bear arms. Let's fast forward past multiple mass shootings that took place since that day. The presidency of George W. Bush saw many gains for the gun rights movement. Teary-eyed President Obama, coming off the heels of a 2012 re-election campaign, found himself having to invite parents of 6- and 7-year-olds to the White House who were also victims of a senseless and unnecessary mass shooting. And yet Congress, just like it did in 1999, failed to pass meaningful legislative action to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again. And in 2018, on Valentine's Day, when the nightmare revisited Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, a heavily armed young man unleashed terror on students and teachers, leaving 17 lives tragically cut short, forever etching the horrors in our collective memory. Amidst the devastation, a chilling statement from the NRA spokesperson read, "Many in legacy media love mass shootings. The aftermath of grief and loss was tainted by a narrative that become all too familiar, a cycle of violence, political posturing, and media sensationalism." Within weeks, while speaking to the Columbine community, of course, President Clinton pushed back against the NRA. Now, President Trump invited the Marjory Stoneman Douglas students, survivors, to come to the White House for a session to hear their concerns, where he promised to pass sensible gun control efforts. Fred Guttenberg is not just an activist against gun violence, but a father of one of the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas, Jamie, and he had suffered unimaginable loss. His new book, American Carnage, Shattering the Myths That Fuel Gun Violence, has courageously dissected the falsehoods that perpetuate the devastating epidemic. Fred Guttenberg is a powerful story. It's the story of a parent turned activist, a voice that refuses to be silenced, and a mission that resonates far beyond the confines of tragedy. Mr. Guttenberg, thank you so much for being part of the Political Mike.
Mike, good to see you. Good to be with you. Thank you.
So, Mr. Guttenberg, you chose for the title of your book, American Carnage, specifically a line that famously was used in Donald Trump's 2017 inaugural speech.
Yeah.
Could you walk us through your decision to choose that particular phrase for this book?
Well, unlike his make-believe vision that he presented in that speech, uh, American Carnage accurately describes what happened to my daughter and what happens across America every single day of the year. And it wasn't always this way, but we really wanted to show America, not just through the title, but through the content in the book, um, where we are as a country today when it comes to gun violence and how we got here. But American Carnage sums up who we are. Listen, we for the past, call it 30 years, we've turned over the debate around guns to the gun lobby. They've controlled the narrative. They've controlled the legislation. They've gotten their way. And the result of getting their way is what we now see. 40,000 plus people a year dying. You talked the numbers before. We're over 400 mass shootings already this year. We are now in a situation where the weapon most commonly used in a mass shooting is the AR-15. And when it's used, it's far more deadly than other weapons. There's no other way to describe this reality but American Carnage. It is uniquely American. It's exactly what you said. And my hope is, with our book, people will read it, they will understand the truth versus the myths and the lies, and they'll be well educated to talk about it, and then ultimately to go out and vote because of it.
So, Mr. Guttenberg, could you walk us through, how you found the strength to transform your personal grief into a powerful force for change, and what advice do you have for others who are facing their own tragedies?
I'm not sure if there'll be a video component with this, but I know you're seeing over my shoulder that painting. That's my daughter. She was a competitive dancer, and somebody made that painting of a photo of her dancing, and I leave it behind me like that with her literally towering over my shoulder because that's where I get the strength. She's always on my shoulder pushing me forward. I am a dad of two children, Jesse and Jamie. I am a dad who always cared about this issue, but I was silent on it. I didn't use my voice until after it was my daughter. I know what my voice has meant to this movement, and I have guilt that it took me my loss to become a part of this movement. But I can tell you this, the desire that I have to stop the next one, to stop the next parent from knowing what I know is where I get my strength to go forward. This is a fight that I will never stop having.
What has your experience been like with lawmakers on the state and national level as you have been pushing for change since 2018? Of course, I was there during the March for Our Lives rally back in 2018. I've always said the atmosphere there could not be encapsulated by TV cameras.
Correct.
There were so many people there from so many different walks of life, so many generations coming together. And you really had this kind of sense that this was finally the breaking point. It was the movement was so organized. I remember text messages being sent out, and you could basically just opt in to send a letter to your congressman or senator and have boilerplate language, of course, and add whatever specific ideas and feelings you have towards this issue in that boilerplate language to send. I thought the movement was such a game changer. And yet during the Trump administration, of course, we saw no progress on this front. And in the Biden administration, although we finally have the Safer Communities Act, there are those who are saying this is just a floor and not the ceiling.
Well, let me say regarding the Safer Communities Act, while it wasn't all that I would hope for, not even close, I would still describe it as very necessary, but we need to do more. And it was the first gun safety legislation in 30 years. Don't underestimate the significance of that. The gun lobby lost. They lost. And they lost on some really important things. There's now enhanced background checks for young people, which, by the way, is working. There's now data showing just how many young kids have been stopped from acquiring guns because of the enhanced background checks. That saves lives. The information that we're getting on the Safer Communities Act and its effect on the trafficking of weapons has been significant. Why does that matter? Because for the very, very, very first time in a lot of years, we may have turned the curve on the homicide rate related to guns. It is declining for the very first time. It's not nearly enough, but it's a start. And only possible because Americans, after my daughter was killed in 2018, turned out and voted, and we flipped the House of Representatives. Only possible because in 2020, Americans turned out and voted, and we moved the Senate to control under the Democrats, and we elected President Joe Biden. And without Americans voting to do those things, we wouldn't have even gotten the Safer Communities Act, but Americans did. So to answer your question that you initially started asking about, what is my experience with politicians? As you would expect, those who want to take steps to reduce gun violence, they're Democrats. Those who refuse to even acknowledge the reality of the gun and gun violence, they're not Democrats. And so we have an election coming up in 24. And people always ask me why I have so much hope about where we're going to be, because I think Americans are going to show up and vote in record numbers. This will be a top reason why. And I think after the 24 election, we are going to get additional significant gun safety legislation, but you better vote.
Have you spoken to, your Senator Marco Rubio? At the time, Bill Nelson was senator, of course. Now he's been replaced by the former governor of Florida,
Scott,
who was the head of the senatorial campaign for the GOP in the 2022 midterms. Have you spoken to these gentlemen, the governor of the state currently running for president, Ron DeSantis, any of these folks? I was thinking back on the CNN town hall that took place shortly after that shooting in 2018. Mm-hmm. And for the first time, it felt as if these folks and the spokesperson of the NRA had to answer questions directly from the people who were on the ground when the tragedy happened. And there was no filtering. There was no press team to clean up any kind of misstep or misword. These were the two sides finally meeting together. And I wanted to know if you had the experience of meeting one-on-one with any of these folks.
So all of them. And so you may recall the CNN town hall, and we'll start there, that I had a serious engagement with Marco Rubio. And really over his inability to say the word gun. He just couldn't even acknowledge that this was gun violence. He was taken to task very effectively by myself and the others on the money he receives from the gun lobby to speak the way he speaks and to not do the things that he just refuses to do. Over the course of the next year, I actually continued to have very regular discussions with Marco, meet with him regularly. I've described him, though, as kind of like having a dog that chases their tail. You run in circles with him, going nowhere, and never really accomplishing the goal. And that's Marco. He runs you in circles, but you're never going to catch the tail. And I eventually just decided I had more productive uses of my time, one of which was doing everything I possibly could to eventually have somebody replace him. As for current Senator Scott, who was governor at the time, Governor Scott immediately became an ally after the shooting to do something about reducing gun violence. He helped lead the effort to pass real, meaningful gun safety legislation in the state of Florida, where we raised the age to 21, we instituted a waiting period, we passed red flag laws. And Governor Rick Scott help lead on that. And we spent quite a bit of time communicating, and I was proud to be able to work with him. The problem is Governor Rick Scott became Senator Rick Scott. And Senator Rick Scott wants to forget that Governor Rick Scott ever existed. And so Senator Rick Scott has gone all in on this MAGA approach and is wanting to forget the important role he played in saving lives in Florida because it doesn't serve him well now. I've tried to speak to Senator Rick Scott, but again, he is who he is. And my efforts now will be focused on ultimately replacing him. Governor DeSantis, I got to know quite well early in his administration. He worked with the Parkland families to hold individuals accountable who failed, and I was happy to be a part of that. The problem is, one of the things that I worked with him on was removing the sheriff at the time. And many people told me it would be a terrible thing to do because it really pushes the bounds of constitutionality within the state, and it would embolden him to behave like a tyrant. And I thought that was ridiculous at the time. What did I know? But I was wrong. And I can acknowledge that now. I've actually, for quite some time, I was wrong. I mean, he has come to behave like a tyrant. He is not somebody who is at all supportive of the law we passed in Florida to reduce gun violence. He is not somebody who is at all supportive of stopping the next act of gun violence. In fact, he just worked to pass not only permitless carry, but as part of the permitless carry bill, they actually reduced the penalty for anyone caught on a school campus with a gun from a felony to a misdemeanor, making it less of a punishment should you be caught on a school campus the way my daughter's killer was, potentially attempting to engage in gun violence. I despise all three of them, and I want to do everything I can to replace them.
Of course, your interactions with these three politicians just showcases how the debate around gun control often is highly polarized and making it difficult to find common ground. So how did you approach conversations with individuals who have these opposing views? And how do you bridge the gap to foster constructive dialogue? There are folks who just plug their ears the minute they hear any kind of talk of gun control. There are those who have adopted the mantra of the NRA: the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
I wrote
Mental
the book.
health.
So it's why we wrote the book. I don't call it gun control. That's the gun lobby term. That because we're not trying to control anybody or anything. I call gun violence prevention or gun safety. And I also make it clear, I have no issue with gun owners. In fact, I have gun owners in my family. I have an issue with gun violence. And so what I do is I don't engage in the gun lobby language that tries to turn this country into you're either gun owners or non-gun owners. And we are made up of only good guys and bad guys. And all the bad guys have guns. And all the good guys now need guns to protect themselves from the bad guys. That's a gun lobby BS scenario. So what I'll say is this. It is shocking to me how many Republicans I engage every day who agree with me. While they're not in this currently elected version of the Republican Party, because this is an extreme party now, you have a lot of Republicans who have previously served who join me now in the work that I do. And I'll give you an example because we've become very friendly. As an example, former Congressman Joe Walsh of Illinois, okay, one of the original Tea Party guys. He's a gun guy, but he actually has come to agree with me that we need to, as a country, do more to reduce gun violence. And he publicly goes around the country talking about it. Joe Scarborough on MSNBC, he's a Republican. He's a gun guy. He agrees with me now. You have lots of Republicans who agree with me. And so what do they agree with me on? I have 3 metrics, just 3. I want to reduce the gun violence death rate. I want to reduce the instances of gun violence. I want to reduce the severity of gun violence injuries when gun violence happens. And when you look at it from that standpoint, it's not gun control. It's, okay, what are the things that we can do together to make that happen? Background checks, banning high-capacity magazines. In my mind, the holy grail of solving this issue, because we already have 400 million weapons, is let's extend background checks to ammunition. Because you already have all these people with guns who shouldn't have them, and they can just walk into a store and buy the bullets. Let's extend background checks to ammunition. Let's raise the age nationally to 21. Let's repeal PLCA, the law that shields this industry that has flooded our streets from any liability for the carnage that they cause. There's so much we can do, and that a lot of Republicans and Democrats agree on, that we should be doing that. Unfortunately, this current version of the Republican Party is extreme.
You made me think about the recent returns in the last election in the state of Florida, where Ron DeSantis, of course, just trounced his opponent, the former governor, Charlie Crist. Yeah. And then you have for Senate Marco Rubio, way out Val Demings. Yep. It seems like the state of Florida is getting more and more red as we're getting further and further along. Of course, Florida is still in the swing state column, but in recent elections, it just seems as if Florida is becoming increasingly a Republican state.
So, listen, in the last election, it was, and one of the things that DeSantis did exceptionally well is he turned out his base. He turned out his voters. And I hate to say it, on the Democratic side, we had some underwhelming campaigns, and Democrats didn't turn out. They didn't. It's not that Ron DeSantis is loved by 19 points. It's his voters voted and the Democrats didn't. And so Florida, if you go back to elections just before the last one, they're a hell of a lot closer than that. And that really is who Florida is. The Democratic Party in Florida right now is truly re-energized under my friend Nikki Fried, who's now running the party in the state. We will have better candidates going forward. I think not just the country is getting to see the real Ron DeSantis and not like him. Floridians are becoming cognizant of the fact that his ability to focus on red meat BS, woke nonsense, which turned out his base, has actually left Florida in a pretty bad place because he didn't focus on governing. So there's some things happening in Florida now that are not good. And we're for the first time seeing an exodus of people from the state. People can't afford the homeowners insurance in the state. So there's a reality to his failure to govern that Floridians have woken up to. In the next election, you're going to see, I think, a response to that. And as evidence, I think it's already happened. If you look up in Jacksonville, a Republican stronghold part of the state, not a Democratic part of the state, Donna Deegan just won the Ron DeSantis endorsed candidate for the mayor's race. Okay. So I have a feeling Florida is a state that people shouldn't be looking at with alarm that has gone all red over the edge yet, because I think I think Democrats are going to come back here.
So, of course, your book delves into, debunking some of the complex myths that have been pervasive in this whole debate about gun control. Could you elaborate on some of those most pervasive myths that you've encountered, and how do they hinder progress towards finding effective solutions?
Well, I'll start with where we started the book, which is who we are as a country. You know, the country wasn't always this way. In fact, for most of our country's history, we have been a country with gun owners, but with respect for gun safety and responsible ownership. We have been a country that has always passed gun safety laws. Okay, always. In fact, if you look at the most recent Bruin decision, it didn't turn over a law that was new and controversial on the books. It turned over a law that was passed over 100 years ago. Okay, because we always pass gun safety measures in this country. And so that's the first myth, that we are a country of where we have all these gun owners and their rights supersede our rights and we have to deal with it. Here's what happened. In 1977, a guy by the name of Harlan Carter took over the NRA. And Harlan, nobody knew it at the time because he changed a vowel in his name, was actually a convicted murderer. And Harlan is the guy that moved the NRA in a whole new direction. Up until 77, they were actually an entity that supported safety, that supported training. They supported all of that stuff. But in 1977, Harlan took over and spent the next bunch of years redirecting the NRA to get involved in politics, to find new avenues to sell guns, which included connecting with the gun lobby. Why did they need to do that? Gun sales were going down. We no longer had a draft. Hunting wasn't as big a sport as it had been. Gun sales were going down. So they connected with the gun lobby and they started developing this new scenario that Americans need guns to defend themselves. And they started doing this junk science to push that narrative, but their studies were terrible. I mean, they've all been discredited. But the narrative stayed. And the slogans that they created stayed. So this whole notion of we need to defend ourselves didn't really start to pick up steam until the 80s. It's not like it's been our whole history. And you really saw it in the 90s with some shall carry laws. But the first big change that the NRA was really successful at didn't happen until 2005. And it was Stand Your Ground that happened here in Florida. There's a reason why gun violence as we know it is really a phenomenon of the 2000s. It's really just been since then. If you go back 20 years ago to when my daughter was born, 20 years ago, we were less than 200 million weapons in America. Today, we're over 400 million. If you go back 20 years ago, AR-15 sales were less than 2% of all guns sold. Today, they're 25%. That is everything you need to know to understand gun violence, those two things that I just told you. And so the idea that this is just who we are as a country and we need to accept it is bogus. And I want people to understand that and understand we have a right to be free from gun violence and to safety. I'll give you an example of one of the many ways that they did that. You used the slogan before, and I'll start it. You finish it. The only thing that stops a bad guy
with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Okay, you feel like you've heard that forever, right?
Exactly. Yes.
You know when that started?
It was after Sandy Hook.
Right after Sandy Hook. That one never existed before that. It was the NRA response to the Sandy Hook shooting. They actually took the Sandy Hook shooting and turned it into a gun sales bonanza. Okay? Only 10 years ago. This is not who we are as a country in our history, and we need to stop assuming that we have to be okay with this. We have to be done listening to the liars. No more listening to the liars. We have a right to safety, to freedom from gun violence. And I think after the next election, we're going to be in a place where we can finally do far more about it.
You know, I've had Beto O'Rourke on the program, of course, and we talked about the exchange that took place where he encountered Governor Greg Abbott during a press
Yep.
conference on the
He's
heels
terrific.
right, of the Uvalde shooting. And of course, he had his goons jump in and defend him by trying to say, well, stop politicizing the issue. That Beto O'Rourke was a sick guy who's coming to try to politics of this tragedy. But the thing that I said was, you know, on the debate stage, they're not going to have, Abbott is not going to have the benefit of these goons defending him and creating a barrier around him there. And so he's going to have to answer for, you know, his action that made it even more possible for anybody to get their hands on a semi-automatic weapon or military assault rifle in the state of Texas. But just like all the other Republicans, you know, you go back to the state of North Carolina, they had their gubernatorial election in 2020.
Sure.
And Forrest made the same argument that Abbott made, that this is a matter of mental health. But yet when you look at what they do on mental health, it's, you know, reducing the amount of state and federal funds allocated to combat mental health. How does the movement that you're a part of shed more light and draw the connections more closely for people to see that there's clear hypocrisy on the part of those who claim that this is not a gun problem, it's a mental health problem, and yet they still want to do little to nothing on mental health?
Well, listen, but that's why facts matter, right? And you're right. They don't want to actually do anything. They want to only be able to have it as an issue. They want to be able to say it's mental health, not the gun, but they don't want to address mental health. And by the way, they don't want to do, assuming what they said was true, that it's a mental health issue, they actually don't want to make it any harder for those with mental health to get a gun. So they don't want to solve anything. Listen, because it's all a lie. Here's the facts. There is a mental health component to gun violence. Okay. And the reason I say that is more than half of all the deaths related to gun violence are suicide. Okay. So there is a mental health component, and we need to be doing more to address those who are a risk to someone else or themselves. There's no question about it, which, by the way, the Safer Communities Act does. And it puts a whole lot of new money into mental health. The first real change in mental health in years in this country because of the Safer Communities Act. But the majority of gun violence that is mental health related is self-directed. When you look elsewhere, those with a mental health issue are far more likely to be a victim of gun violence than a perpetrator of gun violence. Just a fact. Okay, so we need to do more to help those with mental health who find themselves in situations where they may become victims of gun violence, and support them so that that doesn't happen. However, it is true that sometimes those with mental health issues become violent, and they become not just a risk to themselves, but others. That is why I am so proud of the law we passed here in Florida, the red flag law, okay, which gives law enforcement and the judicial system a mechanism to remove weapons when due process has been served from those who are a threat to themselves or someone else. There are other states that have also gone and passed red flag laws, and as part of the Safer Communities Act, there is now far more language and there's money for those states who have them to implement them, or for those who don't yet to do so. Because red flag laws save lives, full stop. So I just, listen, this whole notion of mental health infuriates me to no end, because it's those who do it. They do it so that they don't have to say the word gun. So they have to talk about the gun and gun violence. Okay. There is a real mental health component that should be discussed, as we just did. And for those who want to blame mental health, if you're not behind passing extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws, shut the hell up. Don't get involved in this conversation, because you don't actually want to save lives.
It's 2018. Have you seen any kind of progress in the dialogue around school safety and gun violence since that tragic day, Valentine's Day 2018?
Well, listen, without a doubt, there's been a whole lot of work done to make schools more secure, more fortress-like, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. And there's been my friend Max Schachter, who lost his son in Parkland, has been heroic, traveling this country, meeting with school administrators, going to Washington, D.C. to implement policies and ways of collecting data to reduce violence and gun violence in schools. The reason why I am purely focused on guns is quite simple. Gun violence doesn't only happen in schools. The truth is, we have about 115,000 schools in America. Since Columbine, which you mentioned earlier, there's been just under 400 instances of school violence. While it's horrific when it happens, it's not frequent. And so the reality of gun violence is far more spread out than that. And the way to secure schools from gun violence is to deal with the gun.
So, of course, the United States has a unique relationship with guns. There are those who argue that any kind of measure would be an infringement upon the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. How can we strike a balance, in your view, between preserving constitutional rights and enacting measures to protect public safety?
So I would make an argument that enacting measures to protect public safety do not impact the Second Amendment. A true reading of the Second Amendment does not prevent it. And, again, we've gone through most of our country's history finding that balance without an issue. What makes things different now is the past 20 years, because in the past 20 years, we have so exploded the numbers of weapons in America, not necessarily spread them out across more families or more households. In fact, that's one of the myths in the book, is just everybody's got a gun. Well, no, it's still concentrated in about a third of the population. People are just carrying bigger arsenals. The problem is when you have that many guns, it is really easy for people who shouldn't be in possession of them, who do intend harm, to get access to one. So taking steps to reduce gun violence, whether it's a ban on high-capacity magazines, or a ban on assault weapons, or raising the age, or red flag laws. These are not affronts to the Second Amendment. I am concerned that this current Supreme Court, which has had some really unfortunate rulings on many issues, including guns, may take a different viewpoint, because they'll expand what the Second Amendment is. They've already done that with the Bruin case. But that doesn't mean that they're constitutionally right. I would argue, and looking at some of their decisions on a variety of topics, that they are radical. So we keep the fight up. We keep pushing forward, and we keep working at it, because stopping the next instance of gun violence matters more to me than anything else I'll ever do.
You had mentioned some of the unexpected allies you actually had the privilege of working with. You mentioned Congressman Walsh, then Governor Rick Scott, before he became Senator Scott. In the current Congress, are there any folks that you see on the other side of the aisle that could reasonably and realistically join forces with the movement, with Democrats, to take it a step further? I know the president has constantly said that his goal is to ban military assault weapons in this country once and for all. And that, of course, is just a nod to your movement. There are lots of folks that say the president can't do anything substantively in this current Congress, and possibly has to look to the 2024 election and beyond if he was to do anything more progressive. Do you agree with that assessment? And do you see any potential allies on the other side of the aisle in this current Congress?
I do agree with that assessment. Nothing is happening in the House of Representatives. I mean, zero. And John Cornyn of Texas, who led the negotiation with Chris Murphy to get this Safer Communities Act passed, has made it clear that is the last that he will ever take on this issue, that he will not go any further. He took a lot of blowback from the radicals, and he won't touch this again. So while Safer Communities Act was actually a bipartisan bill, there were Republican votes on the House and the Senate side. I think as things stand now, until after the 24 election, there won't be anybody from the other side. If they get thoroughly defeated in the 24 election, as I anticipate they will, and it is clear that this is one of the top voting issues as to why, I suspect you can get back to a bipartisan approach. But this version of this party has to be annihilated.
And looking to the future, of course, there were reports that said that Gen Z came out in numbers that broke previous Gen Z records and millennial record. But there, you compare the voting turnout for millennials and Gen Z, mm-hmm. It dwarfs in comparison to the baby boomer generation to Generation X. So as more Gen Z members become of age to vote in 2024 and 26 and 28, do you anticipate that the stronghold that the NRA has on Capitol Hill right now would be reduced, and that we would see more progressive changes on this front?
Listen, there's a reason why red states are trying to make it as hard as possible for young people to vote, because the truth is they are. Young people are going to become the largest class of voters in this country in the not too distant future. And what I learned after Parkland is this. I always thought young people didn't care. I always thought young people didn't know how to communicate, partly because, everybody was always too busy on their phones, right? They had this thing and they were always on their phone and nobody knew how to talk. But I was wrong, because these kids who started March for Our Lives, who, by the way, I knew because my kids were in school with them, okay, went ahead and did something that I didn't expect. They did start talking. They did know what they want. They were fierce and asking for what they wanted. And the phone that I thought was a devastating thing that was ruining them actually was their weapon. They used that phone to strategize, to organize and communicate in ways that old people like me couldn't keep up with. And so I had, up until 2018, I had the young people wrong. But I go across this country now, and everywhere I go, I love meeting our young people because they are determined. And the key thing is this, and this isn't just a message for young people. It's a message for all Americans who have had it with where we are. Don't complain. Vote. Just vote. Don't worry about falling in love with a candidate if they stand with you on the issues of reducing gun violence, of voting rights, of choice, of the environment. You don't have to fall in love. You don't have to be completely inspired. They're not a clergy, so don't worry about perfection, but vote for them. Get up and vote. I don't care if you're young or you're not young, okay? This is the election where it's all on the line. So vote. I want record turnout in this election. I think we're going to have it in just a tremendously big, huge way. But people have to vote. That's how we solve problems.
There's been a lot of talk about a third party, no labels candidate.
Yeah.
How does that factor into this push to generate and turn out the vote? When you have potentially a Democrat in Joe Manchin, someone who has made it a point to derail and stall much of the president's legislative agenda, which would have been more in alignment with the goals and mission of your advocacy and its work. and a Republican running as his running mate in the form of John Huntsman, former governor of Utah. How would that factor into your push to get Generation Z, get millennials out to vote? Would it serve as somewhat of a deterrent, as people would anticipate the vote would be split for their preferred candidate?
Yeah.
Or do you think that this would actually motivate people to actually come to the polls more?
Listen, I think I'll answer it this way. No matter what, vote. I do hope no labels moves on from this crazy idea, because putting that into the mix guarantees another Trump term. And honestly, it guarantees the end of the democracy as we know it. It guarantees the end of our ability to do things to meaningfully reduce gun violence, to meaningfully protect choice, to meaningfully protect voting rights, to meaningfully protect the environment. That's what it means. And so I do hope no labels at some point backs off from this crazy idea. But we'll worry about that when the time comes. So far, we have what looks like two candidates that we're going to have to choose from, and I'm all in on Joe Biden.
Through your experiences and insights, what lessons do you believe the next generation should take to heart when tackling social issues and advocating for change in their communities?
Always be fierce with what you believe. Don't ever compromise who you are in a way where you don't fight for what's right. I always told my kids, always do what's right, not what's easy. And that would be my advice to the next generation. Always fight for what's right. And never, ever allow yourselves to buy into the notion that your voice doesn't matter and that your vote doesn't matter. Because I'll say this, as a country, for far too many elections, we have done a terrible job voting. And I don't mean we voted for the wrong people. I mean, not enough of us voted, and so we ended up with the wrong people. Okay? And so to the young people, don't ever allow your generation to look like mine, where too many of you sit home and don't vote.
Well, Mr. Guttenberg, this has been a privilege and honor. I want to invite you, if you have the time between now and the next election, to come back on the platform. I thoroughly enjoyed this crucial discussion. I think it's important. Your voice is much needed. As we're considering all of these different factors
Sure.
that could potentially go one way for one party or one way for the other. I'm glad that you stressed the need to turn out to vote, regardless of any kind of personal feelings towards a particular candidate. As long as that candidate's in alignment with your agenda, with your goals, get out and vote. So, Mr. Guttenberg, thank you so much. I'm forever grateful to you, sir, for making the time. Are there any last thoughts that you would like to leave with the audience before we conclude today's episode?
I'll just say this. I'm going to go back and harp on voting. We are just over a year out from our next election. I mean, it's crazy how close we are to it. And take this next year, wherever you are, to work to register voters, to show up at town halls, to show up at political events, to use your voice, And most importantly, make sure you and everyone you know votes. The 24 election may well be our last chance to get this right. So let's go all in and make sure we do.
Thank you so much, Mr. Guttenberg. And of course, the name of the book, American Carnage. Excellent read.
Thanks, Mike.
Highly recommend. So thank you so much for what you brought to the table, Mr. Guttenberg. With that being said, that would conclude episode 112 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all for tuning in.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.